Right, so it is often the case that when politicians have some kind of a brainwave, some sort of wonderful idea that's come to them, or in Keir Starmer's case here more of a brain fart, that there is some form of historical precedent we can refer to that shows why a great new government plan might well be doomed to failure, simply because it's been tried before and it didn't work. Now and again, however, you get something come up so depraved and sickening you can't believe it's come back again, but the historical precedent should be well known enough to never be repeated. And the combination of a number of recent policy announcements from Starmer's Labour have absolutely set some alarm bells ringing. We've seen Starmer launch his assault on the long-term sick and disabled, seen the plans that will make it much harder for those with mental health problems to claim disability benefits, the drive to get them back into work with more stick and less carrot being driven through a choice between earning your poverty or be subjected to even worse, wages hardly keeping up with the cost of living anymore after all as it is. But when you combine that with Starmer's lust for war, his increase in defence spending, laughably called defence spending, paid for by those attacks on the disabled, by the slashing of international aid, and his war drum beating towards Vladimir Putin, well, suddenly a very dark shadow from the past is cast across all of this, and some people have picked up on it. If you haven't yet, though, stay tuned and I'll explain. Right, so in a move that has drawn significant criticism as well as historical parallels, Keir Starmer's Labour government has unveiled plans to tackle unemployment by pushing more people, or at least attempting to paint a very rosy picture, paint as rosy a picture of it as possible anyway, to join the British Army. What's being aimed mainly at young unemployed Brits, the fact that there is this war on the long-term sick and disabled at the same time, that mental health is rising as people find it increasingly more difficult to get out of poverty, and that government policy is very much driving this at the same time that Starmer and co are going around doing this recruiting sergeant routine, has drawn a very unsettling comparison to something that was tried before and to utterly catastrophic conclusion. This recruitment campaign, framed as Starmer's great solution to both joblessness and military recruitment shortfalls, the British military, for all of Starmer's rhetoric, currently the smallest it's been since the days of Napoleon, bears an unsettling resemblance to something called Project 100,000, which, if you haven't heard of it, was an absolute disaster. It was a disastrous Vietnam War era initiative by then US Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. It was so disastrous, it ended up earning the nickname McNamara's Folly, because the program lowered military entry standards to draft tens of thousands of underqualified men, leading to disproportionately high casualties and long-term trauma amongst those who never ever should have been sent to war in the first place. Here's an explanatory excerpt from the Medic in the Green Time blog. See if you can spot the parallels to what happened then and what Starmer's talking about doing now. At various times in its history, the US military has recruited people who measured below specific mental and medical standards. During the Vietnam War, McNamara's morons, as they were called, were barely literate, or could not read or write, or did not speak English. They were underweight, or obese, were too short, or semi-blind, or missing fingers. In basic training, they often could not tie their shoes, button their uniforms, march in drills. Many failed at physical exercise, at tossing hand grenades, could not quickly assemble weapons, or smartly shoot at moving targets. These clearly unqualified men were deliberately sought by Defence Secretary Robert McNamara, who in 1966 required more troops but did not wish to alarm the middle class. Under Project 100,000, pitched as a way path out of poverty, service entry standards were drastically lowered. In addition to men of low intellect, tens of thousands of other inferior men were inducted, including criminals, misfits, and even men physically disabled. This plan was called Project 100,000, for that is how many McNamara sought, but actually 354,000 men were sent to Vietnam who never ever should have been sent there. Facing recruitment shortages and public resistance to the Vietnam War, Defence Secretary Robert McNamara lowered enlistment standards to admit 100,000 additional soldiers per year, many of whom were functionally illiterate, had low IQs, or suffered from physical and mental health conditions that would have previously disqualified them. The programme was marketed as a Great Society initiative, supposedly offering disadvantaged men education and career opportunities. In reality, it was a cynical ploy to just meet draft quotas, and the results were catastrophic. Project 100,000 recruits died at 3 times the rate of other soldiers, and likely contributed to the deaths of many other soldiers, as they proved to be more of a liability than anything else. Many of the men sent there were completely unprepared for combat, leading to severe cases of PTSD and mental breakdowns at a much higher rate as well. It was also a complete and utter exploitation of the most disadvantaged, deliberately sought out by McNamara. It also sought out those on low incomes and amongst minority communities, leading to military service becoming a poverty draft. By the war's end, Project 100,000 was widely condemned as having been an ethical and moral failure, and yet, as I'm sure you've twigged to by now, Starmer's Labour seem intent on repeating these same mistakes with what they are actively doing now. The 1987 Stanley Kubrick classic Full Metal Jacket, an absolute classic. For those who have seen it, great film, and I'm not a great fan of war films particularly, but you might well recall Vincent D'Onofrio's slow-thinking, slow-witted Private Pyle from that film, and how he was treated. That was a perfect rendition of a project man. Away out of poverty, thrown off your benefits, especially sickness or disability benefits as they are made harder to claim. The parallels are there between McNamara's folly and Starmer's cruelty and his push towards army recruitment, as well as these massive cuts to the most vulnerable. And it certainly isn't just me saying so. Starmer appears to be reviving this failed model, not only to address unemployment, but also to bolster British military numbers, potentially leading to direct involvement in Ukraine. Starmer's preparedness to do as much, desperate for a Falklands moment as he appears to be to save his plummeting polling, and having proven how cruel he can be via the cuts he's inflicting, who would right now put it past him to send people to Ukraine who have no other options open to them, with Starmer shutting the doors to other avenues to them as fast as he seemingly can? This is a supposed human rights lawyer, formally anyway, and yet this all raises alarming moral and ethical concerns. How much more of a monster could this man actually be? Labour's new policy urges young people on benefits to consider military service as an alternative to unemployment. This comes alongside harsh welfare reforms that strip disability benefits from thousands, particularly those with mental health conditions, forcing them into work or presumably this option of military enlistment amidst a time of great military shortages. And this should be of grave concern to us all. What we have here is a concerted drive towards targeting the vulnerable by cutting disability and sickness benefits, pushing those people who lose their support towards making more extreme choices, seemingly having no other choice, between trying to find work as unemployment rises, due in no small part to the national insurance hikes on employers. Again, this government did that, increasingly resulting in a potential choice with no work available or very little of it, between destitution or the army. Already there have been surges in calls to suicide helplines off the back of Starmer's disability reforms, indicative of the desperation already there. Where this might be presented here as something of a choice, it really isn't a choice at all, because it is coercion into the armed forces under economic duress. No work, no support, but hey, the army are recruiting, how about them? I'm sure Ukraine is lovely at this time of year and all of that. Ukraine is relevant to this picture as well, because Zelensky has literal conscription squads right now going around press-ganging men into fighting Russia. People are literally in hiding there now. And knowing how desperate Starmer would love to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, extending the war as that would do instead of suing for peace, is this economic coercion not just another way of forcing conscription as well? History shows that lowering military standards for recruitment leads to higher casualties and suffering, and we've got to watch Starmer like a hawk to make sure this doesn't happen. Project 100,000 recruits in Vietnam were more likely to die, desert, or suffer mental collapse, and Starmer's plan, if this is his plan, as I say, the parallels are there, risk the same outcome. Keir Starmer's plan to recruit the unemployed into the army is not just a potential revival of McNamara's folly, it is an even more cynical exploitation of the poor and the vulnerable. By slashing disability benefits and pushing desperate people into military service, Labour is effectively reinstituting a poverty draft here too, all whilst potentially escalating Britain's involvement in Ukraine, and all for his own ends ultimately, unpopular as he is. Lowering standards for war recruitment leads to death, trauma, and societal betrayal. If Starmer proceeds with a plan along these lines, he will not be solving unemployment. He will be sending Britain's most vulnerable to die in a foreign war that we have no business being involved in. We do not belong putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. The public must resist this dangerous policy, demand real employment solutions, and reject the militarisation of poverty, as seems to be the case here. The parallels that we're watching, the historical precedent we're seeing being repeated in so many different ways. Is Starmer truly prepared to see people risk their lives in the thousands for sake of his own polling? Well, I know what I think about that. Meanwhile, those cuts to disability benefits, they might not save much money at all, as Labour are claiming, since they've all forgotten something absolutely massive. Even in the impact assessment, it seems so. So much for that incompetence and a sheer lack of understanding of the issues driving these cuts would be more harmful than anything the Tories did. So what have they missed? Find out more in this video recommendation. Here is your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe so you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as helping to support the channel at the same time, which is enormously appreciated. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.